Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Fetal Position, episode number 5. This time, we're going to be talking about why you should genetically engineer your children. Hopefully, I don't make too many enemies with this one. Alright, so a little bit of backstory for you guys. As you know, I have a degree in biology, and I also minored in philosophy. And when I was there, I had the opportunity to take a bioethics class. One of the interesting things about the bioethics class was that I was one of the only people in that class that had both a biology and a philosophy background. Now, because of the way my classes lined up, I had 2 extra credits that I needed to fill up. So I did my best to talk to my advisor and people like that to see if there was anything I could do to be able to not have to come back for an additional semester for 2 extra credit hours so that I could get my degree, as soon as possible. I had been in school part-time for almost 7 years at this time. Another story for another time, I suppose. Anyway, so I'm in this bioethics class, and I get permission to do a independent research project under the guidance of the biology professor who was co-teaching the bioethics class. The topic I decided to choose was genetic engineering in human children. Now, when I first decided that I wanted to do this topic, my original thought was that I was going to be pretty much confirming my suspicions regarding where I kind of already stood. I was under the impression that genetic engineering, if it was safe to do so, we should do it, but only to help people. We shouldn't use it to enhance their characteristics. I did a very significant amount of research. I think this is the most amount of research I had ever done during my undergrad years, except possibly for my paper that I wrote for my ancient philosophy class called Rethinking Aristotle, the Unwarranted Rejection of Final Causation in Modern Evolutionary Biology. That was a lot of fun to write, but I'll put both of these papers in the show notes. They're just on my blog at this point. But with the genetic engineering paper, it was under the guidance of my biology professor. And like I said, I thought I was going to be coming to a certain conclusion that was pretty much just the whole point of me writing this paper was so that I could confirm my suspicions about where I thought I stood. Turns out, I did not confirm my suspicions. I actually ended up changing my entire conclusion about 3/4 of the way through because I simply could not find good enough arguments to support the position that I previously held. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're arguing for genetic engineering? Yes. That's what I will be doing. I have had some responses from different people. One of them was actually from a guy I look up to. His name is Lenny Esposito. He is an apologetics kind of guy, and he runs a blog called Come Reason Ministries. And because I posted this article a really long time ago, he responded on June 15th, 2015, so almost a year ago at this point. I do plan on addressing some of the things that he talks about because he does bring up some interesting things that I don't think I fully fleshed them out in this paper, but I did address them, but at some point I want to address the things that he has said about the paper. However, before I do that, I want to get into something more current event-y, kind of like I did last episode. It's not going to be much, just want to make a couple little comments about it. I hope you enjoyed last week when I talked about how far along my wife was with our unborn son, Cole. She was 32 weeks last week, and so she's 33 weeks this week, and I'm going to read what Baby Center has to say about that because, again, fetal development is awesome. So this this is from Baby Center, and it says, how your baby is growing. This week, your baby weighs a little over 4 pounds and has passed the 17-inch mark, and apparently he's about the size of a pineapple. No wonder she's uncomfortable. He's rapidly losing that wrinkled alien look, and his skeleton is hardening. The bones in his skull aren't fused together, which allows them to move and then slightly overlap, thus making it easier for him to fit through the birth canal. The pressure on the head during birth is so intense that many babies are born with a cone head-like appearance. These bones don't entirely fuse until early adulthood, so they can grow as his brain and other tissue expands during infancy and childhood. So yeah, that's where my unborn son is as development is continuing. I also hope you enjoyed the cameo that my born son, Micah, played during the last episode. If you didn't get a chance to hear that, you can just fast forward to like the last 15 seconds of the previous episode. I did not get a chance to record him saying anything this time, but who knows? Maybe I will in the next couple weeks. I'll be able to see if there's anything new that he's been able to say, or maybe I'll tack it onto the end of it. All right, so the next thing I want to address is this. Okay, well, actually, before I address this article, what I want to do is every 5th episode, so episode 5, 10, 15, 20, so-and-so, I want to touch on issues that don't necessarily deal exclusively with abortion. That might include I believe I'm going to be calling it afterbirth. It might talk about my afterbirth section, which we'll get into possibly organ donation, not stem cell research. Well, actually, yeah, stem cell research. So any episode that is 1 through 4 or 6 through 9, I want to talk about abortion specifically, the politics around abortion, the ethical issues surrounding abortion. But every 5th episode, I want to do something outside of that. And the genetic engineering one, because it's not specifically related to abortion, I figured was a good fit here. And I also want to talk about this article that I just found. It was posted on Facebook by a friend of mine, and it is from IFL Science. For those of you guys who don't know what that is I effing love science. Side note, I can't help but think that they weren't expecting to be all this popular when they decided to put the F word in their title and the name of their website. Either way, they've changed it to IFL Science. I'll put the link in the show notes for this, but it's called, the article is called, Biotech Company Granted Ethical Permission to Attempt to Use Stem Cells to Reactivate the Brains of the Dead. Now, I mean, come on. I've seen this movie. We all know how this ends. It's not good. No, I'm not entirely sure at this point where I stand on this, because to be honest, I haven't really even thought about it. Yeah, I mean, if you have some thoughts, that would be awesome. But anyway, I'm going to summarize some of the things that they say in this article here. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that they're going to attempt to use stem cells to reactivate the brains of the dead. As you can imagine, if they're using embryonic stem cells, that is a downside, a definite downside, because in order to be able to get embryonic stem cells, you have to destroy an embryo. Now, that's not necessarily the case as a sort of an inside baseball kind of thing, but I guess that's why you're here, right? To learn kind of the science behind what's going on. I work in a cell culture lab. I don't personally work, but we do have embryonic stem cell lines. Now, you can trace them back to figure out where they initially came from, and the stem cell lines that we use at work were from an embryo that was the cells were harvested from the embryo I believe it was the 1970s. This cell line has been cultivated and frozen and has been being used from that initial embryo since the 1970s. Quite some time. The reason that it works like this is because you can have a certain amount of division, the cell division, that can happen, and it still maintains its the reason that it's working, the embryonic status, the embryonic stem cell status, because the embryonic stem cells are used for certain medical research. The reason that they're used for that medical research is because they function in certain ways. However, if you allow the cell line to multiply enough, then they become mutated. and they cease to function in the way that they were designed and are currently being used. They cease that functioning. So when you have this cell line, you can continue to use it until it gets to that point. Once it gets to that point, you have to harvest new cells. And that is where the rub comes in. Ultimately, we do not want embryos being used for this research if that requires us to harvest new embryos, cells, embryo stem cells, embryonic stem cells, because to doing so requires the destruction of the embryo. Now, in the future, I do plan on getting more into stem cells, embryonic stem cells, what the difference is between them and adult stem cells, why some companies like to use embryonic stem cells. It has to do with the it's called potency. And there has, in the amount of success with embryonic stem cells versus adult stem cells, but that's not for this episode now. That will be in the future. I'm hoping to get someone who is more of an expert on this than I am. One of the books that I just recently bought, I haven't I haven't read it yet, but it is called The Stem Cell Epistles by Michael Buratovich. The subtitle of the book is Letters to My Students About Bioethics, Embryos, Stem Cells, and Fertility Treatments. I remember listening to an interview with him where he was talking about this book, and essentially the backstory is that he was kind of, I don't want to say tutoring, but he was helping his students out and how to think about these concepts from a scientific perspective, but also from an ethical perspective. And as soon as I heard this interview, I'm like, heck yes, I need this book. Maybe I can see if I can get him on the podcast. That would be awesome. I'm not expecting it, but maybe I'll beef up my audience first. Make people like me a little bit more before I reach out to him to see if he wants to come on the show. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and dive back into the article that they talk about bringing people back from the dead with stem cells. So basically what happens here is the researchers want to stimulate the nervous systems of people who are brain dead in order to restart their brain. It says here that BioQuark is the company, is hoping that it's part of the groundbreaking Reanima project, which, reanimation project that will reveal if people can at least be partially brought back from the dead. Now, this reminds me, recently Aladdin has come out of the Disney vault, and it reminds me of when the genie first is brought out of the lamp, and he is talking to Aladdin about what he can and cannot do, and he says he cannot kill anyone, he can't make anyone fall in love with anyone, and
Rule number 3! I can't bring people back from the dead. It's not a pretty picture. I don't like doing it! Other than that, you got it.
Yeah, so I can't imagine that this is going to be a very, as the genie said, a very pretty picture, but what I will do is I'm going to pay attention to the development of this story because I'm interested, but I mean, it might end up being an episode further in the future about, my afterbirth episodes, because this is considerably further after birth. As somewhat of an aside, if you go to reanima.tech/about and you look at their logos, I can't help but think that they look just like the Portal logos, and that gives me the heebie-jeebies just because Portal is probably one of my favorite games, and if you don't know Portal, then I apologize for this slight tangent, but
no one will blame you for giving up. In fact, quitting at this point is a perfectly reasonable response. Quit now, and cake will be served immediately. Fantastic.
Now, we all know the cake is a lie, so, I can't help but think maybe there's something extra going on here. All right, that was stupid. I know, I apologize. I'll get into some meaty content now. So, hold on to your pants, because now I'm going to go ahead and jump from raising people back from the dead to genetically engineering them before they're born. Yay! As a brief aside, I know I have a different voice when I read. Listening back to episode 1 allowed me to recognize that when I talk kind of off the cuff, I have a different tone to my voice than when I read, so I apologize if my reading voice bores you or something, but oh well, What are you going to do? All right, here we go. Most of us would do anything to help our children have the best possible future. We would make sure they had the best prenatal environment, the best diet, and be sent to the best schools, all so they could have the best possible future opportunities. But what would we do if we could, before they were born, alter our child's genes in order to guarantee that advantage? The choice of genetically engineering our children is rapidly becoming a scientific reality, and we are faced with the question, if we are able to safely engineer a child at the genetic level, should we? Genetic engineering is a topic that is greeted with a combination of curiosity, skepticism, and apprehension. Those in favor of genetic engineering have been accused of quote-unquote playing God, whereas those opposed have been characterized as being against scientific progress. Many people view genetic engineering as something confined to the domain of science fiction, something so far in the future that it needn't be worried about. However, with the advance of modern technology, this attitude towards genetic engineering is not only misguided, but it can be dangerous. Nearly every advance in technology comes with unanswered questions, and genetic engineering is no different. What should we do? What will happen if we make certain decisions? How will our decisions affect society? If we have the ability to do it safely, is it ethically permissible to genetically engineer our children? Is there an ethical difference between genetic enhancement and genetic therapy? As people living in the time where genetic engineering is a real possibility, it is vital that we address the bioethical issues surrounding this controversial topic. If we procrastinate in this area and do not address these issues before they come up, we will inevitably make poor decisions that could have been avoided. Like many advancements in science and technology, genetics provides us with an opportunity to be good stewards with what we have, but it also offers us a unique opportunity as well. We can begin to determine not simply who will live and who will die, but what all those who live in the future will be like. This article is designed as a form of philosophical preventative maintenance, with very real ramifications for the near future. Because it is meant to address issues of genetic engineering specifically, other issues will be avoided. I will assume that genetic engineering will not destroy human embryos and will not result in any unintended consequences. These issues need to be addressed by scientists, doctors, and ethicists today, but will likely be circumvented with the advance of technology. The purpose of this paper is to ask, what philosophical issues arise from genetic engineering itself? Many moral philosophers and ethicists, when approaching complex ethical issues, have attempted to lay out a principle of moral reasoning that is designed to answer the question, what ought I do? It seems reasonable, therefore, to follow a basic principle of moral reasoning, and philosopher Kurt Baer explores a fairly simple one in his book, The Moral Point of View. According to Baer, quote, the best course of action is the course of action which is supported by the best reasons, and the best reasons may require us to abandon the aim we actually have set our heart on, unquote. Baer's two-step approach involves looking at the relevant facts surrounding an issue and determining the relative weight of those considerations, quote, to decide which course of action has the full weight of reason behind it, unquote. Following this approach, it is our job to critically examine the arguments for and against genetic engineering and to support the most reasonable conclusion given the strongest available arguments on both sides. Next section I titled here, Enhancement versus Therapy. One important distinction in this discussion is the difference between genetic enhancement and genetic therapy. Therapy can be defined as, quote, an intervention designed to maintain or restore bodily organization and functioning states that are typical for one species, age, and sex, unquote. And enhancement can be defined as, quote, alteration to improve upon normal organization, appearance, health, and functioning, unquote. This distinction is not new to the medical community and has been used in a variety of different contexts, so applying it to the topic of genetic engineering is not without precedent. While there may be some obvious examples of therapy and enhancement, like steroids may be used for either, is there a line that can be neatly drawn to distinguish between therapy and enhancement? Much has been written on this issue, and while the distinction may not exist de jure, a de facto line certainly exists. As Colleton explains, our society is, quote, making a distinction, drawing a line. Its placement may be arbitrary, but that does not mean that no one is making it, unquote. And this distinction is important to make because therapies are generally considered to be medically necessary and indicate medical obligation, whereas enhancements are superfluous. Quote, the line between therapy and enhancement is the line where medical necessity stops and optional or elective procedures begin, unquote. If a strict line between therapy and enhancement can be defined, it is inconsequential to the ultimate conclusion of this paper. My goal is to argue for the moral and legal freedom to genetically engineer our children, regardless of whether or not it is considered to be for therapeutic or enhancement purposes. Therapeutic genetic engineering. We currently have the ability to identify genetic defects in utero, and if our technology were advanced enough, we could genetically engineer gametes and or embryos and return the DNA back to normal functioning. For example, sickle cell anemia is an inherited disorder that causes red blood cells to develop into sickle shapes instead of the normal, healthy disc shape. Those with sickle cell anemia can have a variety of symptoms, including poor circulation, increased risk of infection, and a decreased lifespan. With the advance of modern genetics, we now know that HBB, the gene associated with sickle cell anemia, is found in region 15.5 on the short arm of chromosome number 11 and is 1,600 base pairs long. If we know exactly where the gene is, it is very likely that we will be able to modify the genome in a way that will cure sickle cell anemia before the child is born. When considering the obvious examples of genetic therapy, some have argued that, quote, gene therapy for the treatment of severe disease is considered ethical because it can be supported by the fundamental moral principle of beneficence. It would relieve human suffering. Gene therapy would be, therefore, a moral good, unquote. Others, like Munson and Davis, have argued that, quote, there is no moral reason not to develop and employ germline gene therapy, unquote, and that, quote, medicine has a prima facie moral obligation to do so, unquote. After considering the social and economic factors, far more reasons exist to commend fetal gene therapy than to reject it. We ought to embrace safe genetic therapy as something we should do if given the opportunity. There are several arguments for and against genetic enhancement that must be considered, as well as various responses to those arguments. I will attempt to address 2 arguments in favor of genetic enhancement, 2 arguments against it, and then construct a case for the moral and legal freedom to safely genetically enhance our children. Here's the section called Arguments for Genetic Enhancement. One of the primary arguments in favor of genetic enhancement deals with the idea of the, quote, natural lottery, or traditional child development with no enhancement. The natural lottery, as John Rawls explains in A Theory of Justice, has to do with the biological inheritance a child is born with. In the absence of any genetic modification by the parents, the child's genetic traits are determined largely by chance. Julian Savulescu, the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Medical Ethics, argues that genetic enhancement may be a moral obligation because, quote, if we have the power to intervene in the nature of our offspring rather than consigning them to the natural lottery, then we should, unquote. Chris Seck, former editor of the Stanford Review, says, quote, it is true that genetic engineering may limit children's autonomy to shape their own destinies, but it is equally true that all people's destinies are already limited by their natural genetic makeup, a makeup that they are born with and cannot change, unquote. Many advocates in favor of genetic enhancement point to the fact that parents already select for and against certain conditions with the end goal of producing better children. Many expecting mothers alter their diet and behavior in addition to taking specially designed prenatal vitamins. It is often considered the hallmark of good parenting when the child goes to a good school, is encouraged to be involved in sports, and the parents do whatever they can do to help their child get good grades and get into a good college. Considering this, how is genetic engineering any different? It is true that genetic modification is designed to change things at a much more fundamental level than altering the environment, but the goals are the same: to provide the child with the best possible future, and many experts argue that genetic enhancement does just that. Quote, most parents want to improve the lot of their children, providing a safe environment, a healthy diet, a good education, exposure to diverse experiences are some of the more conventional means of enhancing the health and the opportunities of children, unquote. Here's an argument against genetic enhancement. Many people are concerned that genetic enhancement will infringe on the child's autonomy in a way that makes it much more difficult to shape her own destiny. As Dinesh D'Souza writes, quote, if parents are able to remake a child's genetic makeup, they are in a sense writing the genetic instructions that shape his entire life. If my parents give me blue eyes instead of brown eyes, if they make me tall instead of medium height, if they choose a passive over an aggressive personality, their choices will have a direct, lifelong effect on me, unquote. D'Souza holds personal autonomy in very high regard, including the personal autonomy of children, saying, quote, "Children are not our property," unquote. In response to this idea that we should be free to manipulate the genetic makeup of our children, he asks, quote, "What greater violation of individual autonomy is even conceivable?" Unquote. D'Souza concludes this argument from personal autonomy of the child with this, unquote, quote, "The greatest danger of genetic engineering is that we might become arrogant enough to believe that we cannot only remedy nature's defects but also improve on human nature itself. We should not have the right to try such experiments out on other people, even our own offspring. The children are human persons, and to tamper with their structure in the absence of a clear need, such as to avoid a specific disease, is a fundamental and impermissible violation of their integrity." Unquote. If a parent decides to genetically engineer a child with the goal of being tall, many would argue that the parent's decision is preventing the child from being fully autonomous. If the height of the child works out in her favor, do the parents deserve some, or possibly all, the credit? What if her height works against her in some way? Are the parents to blame? If the child was allowed to develop without any genetic enhancements, or using the natural lottery, her personal autonomy would have never been violated. Her decisions would have been hers alone, and her accomplishments or failures would have fallen on her shoulders. Many arguments against genetic enhancement deal with what would happen if genetic enhancement becomes a normal societal occurrence. Those who argue in this way warn us about social problems that may arise because of genetic enhancement, and they make comparison between genetic enhancements and eugenics. In his paper, The Case Against Enhancement, Michael Sandel argues against enhancement by appealing to humanity's moral conscience. Allowing genetic enhancement, quote, "represents a kind of hyper-agency, a Promethean aspiration to remake nature, including human nature, to serve our purpose and to satisfy our desires. The problem is not the drift to mechanism, but the drive to mastery," unquote. His concern is primarily how this technology will change humanity's view of itself, and he concludes his paper with the idea that genetic enhancement will threaten to, quote, "banish our appreciation of life as a gift, and to leave us with nothing to affirm or behold outside of our own will," unquote. Another potential social problem is the issue of inequality, a problem very well expressed in the movie Gattaca. As a side note, if you haven't seen Gattaca, definitely check it out. All right, continuing. A problem very well expressed in the movie Gattaca, where there are obvious differences between those who are genetically engineered, what they call the valids, and those who are not genetically engineered, or the invalids. In this movie, certain jobs are available only to the valids, jobs that the invalids would never be able to get because of their unengineered genetic code. The invalids, complete with all of their genetic imperfections, were given less respected positions in society, such as janitors and maintenance workers. In one scene, Vincent, the invalid main character, told his father of his dream to become an astronaut, to which his father responded, quote, "The only way you're going to see the inside of a spaceship is if you are cleaning it," unquote. This is because companies in this future society, on which this movie is based, hire people based on genetic screening, not their performance. And this is exactly the type of social inequality that many people in opposition to genetic engineering are concerned about. Quote, "To many, Gattaca is a dystopia where vast gaps between the haves and the have-nots will become intolerable due to the existence of not just material, but also genetic inequalities." And finally, no discussion of genetic enhancement would be complete without a discussion of eugenics. Eugenics is the view that, quote, "advocates the use of practices aimed at improving the genetic composition of a population," unquote, and the Nazi promotion of eugenics has been nearly universally condemned. In Nazi Germany, specific people were targeted as Lebensunwertes Leben, or life unworthy of life, because of certain characteristics, including genetically based diseases and heredity. Many people opposed to genetic enhancement will compare the selection of specific genes in the human genome to what was done during the time of the Nazis. Quote, "The logic behind the argument is that human genetic enhancement perpetuates discrimination against the disabled and the genetically unfit," unquote. And if genetic enhancement discriminates against the disabled and the genetically unfit, then it is a form of eugenics. According to those opposed to genetic enhancement, the manipulation of genetics in an attempt to create designer babies has essentially the same outcome as eugenics. Because of this, we should stay away from anything that puts humanity in the driver's seat of human genetics. They argue that eugenics is nothing more than the humanity's attempt to quote-unquote play God, because there are some things that we, as a species, should not touch. These things should be ultimately left up to God to decide. The next section here is where I respond to the arguments against enhancement. The personal autonomy argument advocated by D'Souza and others essentially says that the child has the right to determine her future, and unnecessary genetic enhancement will violate her personal autonomy. What D'Souza fails to recognize is that the parents make choices regarding the life and welfare of their children all the time, yet no one claims the autonomy of the child is being violated. Expectant mothers will regularly take vitamins to enhance prenatal environment, read or play music to the developing child, and alter her diet, all in an attempt to give the child the best environment possible. After birth, parents deliberately choose the child's nutrition, education, entertainment, and health. In fact, to neglect these things is often seen as inappropriate parenting. These alterations are certainly not a violation of the child's autonomy. They are a hallmark of a good parent. In the same way, selecting for certain traits is not a violation of personal autonomy. It is an attempt to give the child the best possible opportunities in life. Modern genetics research has shown that many traits are determined by both genetics and environment, so to alter the environment may be more, less, or equally integral in the development of specific traits. Critics of genetic enhancement, or any other contentious issue, cloning for example, will assert that those in favor of it are quote-unquote playing God, and that we should rely on nature, or God, to determine genetics. It is obvious that playing God is something that we should not do, according to the critics, but what does it actually mean to play God? When people use the term playing God, it is meant as a precautionary principle, meant to express some kind of discouragement from a specific action. The action associated with playing God is usually new technologies that alter something about the human condition. In this case, genetic engineering is seen as playing God, but couldn't the same argument be used as a catch-all for virtually anything that makes us uncomfortable? I would never say that we shouldn't take the proper precautions when it comes to new technologies, but preventing the advancement of science and technology by an appeal to discomfort does not adequately justify abstaining from it. And finally, social inequality as a result of genetic enhancement. As portrayed in the movie Gattaca, genetic enhancement has the potential to encourage a wider division of the classes. It could create a social division between those who are not genetically engineered and those who are. This is one of the more rhetorically powerful arguments against genetic engineering, not because it makes enhancement something that we should avoid, but because it highlights a pre-existing problem in modern society. There are many things that we currently embrace that seem to encourage a gap between the quote-unquote haves and the have-nots. Education, access to healthcare, access to computers, just to name a few. However, if we want to do something to solve the social division, is it reasonable to ban the technology? Those who are against genetic enhancement are suggesting that we ban it, and that doesn't seem like a very reasonable solution to me at all. If we banned everything that might cause a social division in society, that would require that we ban other things that are thought to be good for society, such as access to education. How we solve this problem is up to us, according to the policies that we put in place, but banning technologies like genetic engineering is not the correct solution. In response to the eugenics comparison, genetic enhancement may be a form of gene selection, but Nazi eugenics and genetic enhancement are different in every morally relevant way. The Nazis would exterminate the quote-unquote unfit living people, whereas genetic enhancement is in the business of creating the best life possible for people. Nazi eugenics was attempting to create a perfect race by killing and sterilizing people, but genetic engineering is attempting to select for certain traits by altering the DNA, not by killing anyone or selecting for a perfect race. In general, the comparison between Nazi eugenics and genetic enhancement conflates the similarities while completely ignoring the obvious differences. The Nazis pursued a eugenics outcome by means of death. Genetic enhancement pursues a eugenics outcome by means of life. Genetic engineering, just like any other new advancement in technology, comes with a wide variety of unanswered questions, and this paper has certainly not addressed every single question. There is a distinction that needs to be made between therapy and enhancement, which has a direct impact on some of the unanswered questions, like insurance considerations and things like that. However, That distinction does not imply that genetic enhancement should be opposed. It suggests that safe genetic engineering should be wholeheartedly embraced. Because of the potential benefits of genetic engineering, we should not allow our discomfort and to prevent our society from exploring it. We should most certainly embrace a precautionary attitude, but we should also embrace genetic engineering for its positive benefits. We need to be extremely careful as we proceed, but we should definitely proceed. One of the most important things is to recognize that we will not be able to outright design a child. We will not be able to say, my daughter will be able to play like Beethoven. All that we will be able to do is to alter the chances of a wide variety of outcomes, something we already do through environmental manipulation. Genetic engineering technology is currently in its infancy, and it would be irresponsible to engage in that kind of unsafe behavior right now. But if our technology continues to advance in a way that makes genetic engineering safe, then our response should be to use that technology to enhance the opportunities of future generations. And that concludes the reading of my Why You Should Genetically Engineer Your Children paper. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed writing it. I enjoyed revisiting it since writing it because my political views have changed somewhat. But I think this was probably one of the early stages of my shift to libertarianism, which is kind of interesting, kind of like a nice little throwback for me. Because some of these things that I was talking about in the paper brought me back to bioethics, and if you read my, I wasn't originally going to talk about this, but if you read how I became a libertarian, I have it on my blog. I'll post that in the show notes as well. It has to do with organ donation being a free market in organ donation, I believe in Iraq, and that increased the number of kidneys to a point where people are now on a waiting list to donate kidneys, as opposed to the people who are now on a waiting list to get kidneys here in the U.S. and in other countries, because the government forces people to donate voluntarily, and because selling your organs is illegal. Anyway, that's a complete side note. But yeah, anyway, so I hope you enjoyed this paper. I hope you enjoyed the stuff about raising zombies up from the dead. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. All my contact information is on thefetalposition.com. The show notes for this page can be found at thefetalposition.com/5. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes, I am always open to the idea. And on that note, I'm going to go ahead and hit the music and conclude everything. Oh, feel free to follow me on @fetal_position on Twitter. That's where I post a lot of things too. So I will talk to you guys next time.